And you're very welcome to the show where myself, Pauline Roche, and Sweyn Hunter, and occasional guests guide you to the world of online communications, a show which was the brainchild of the late great internet evangelist John Popham. So, in true Dr. Tech Show fashion, we ask our guest and our presenters how the weather is where you are. So, Kira Allmann, very welcome to the show. How is the weather where you are? Where are you?
So I'm normally based in Oxford, and the weather has been very, very nice for me. And yeah, it's been actually sunny the last few days, which has been nice.
Good to hear. And Sweyn, how's the weather where you are?
I'm in Orkney as usual, and it's overcast, but once again calm. It seems to have been calm the last 2 or 3 Mondays. I don't know what's going on.
Good to hear. And here in Lahinch in the west of Ireland, it's foggy out the window, so I can't actually see the sea today from where I'm sitting, but I'm sure it'll clear up later. And it's been raining over the last few days, but I have managed to get out, and it's lovely to walk along the seafront. So we have a few celebrations that are happening around this time as we will mark them. And Wednesday, the 17th of March, is, as everybody knows, St. Patrick's Day every year. And this is celebrated annually on the 17th of March, which is the anniversary of St. Patrick, who died in the 5th century. And the Irish have observed this day as a religious holiday for over 1,000 years. It's also celebrated as a holiday in Mauritius, I think. Is not Mauritius? Am I the right? Sorry. I could get that wrong, but there are other countries where Irish people have gone in great numbers, and St. Patrick's Day is a celebration in those countries as well. And it was immigrants, particularly to the United States, who transformed St. Patrick's Day into a largely secular holiday of revelry and celebration of things Irish. And cities with large numbers of Irish immigrants who often wielded political power staged the most extensive celebrations, which included elaborate parades. And on this day, Irish and non-Irish alike commonly participate in the wearing of the green, which means supporting an item of green clothing or a shamrock, which is an Irish national symbol, in their lapel. And if you want to celebrate online in Ireland, there's a festival called Dúsí Éire, which means Awake in Ireland, and has been running since the 12th of March and runs until the 17th. And it's a clarion call to all Irish people across the world to throw off the long dark months and rise to embrace the brighter days ahead. And Swain's got it on screen right now. And in for those
Complete with very impressive snake graphics like that.
yes, um, there's a story that St. Patrick banished snakes from Ireland, and people have different views about that. In London, the London Irish Centre is celebrating St. Patrick's Day on the 17th of March. And the Mayor of London is partnering with the London Irish Centre to provide this virtual event, the St. Patrick's Day special, which will be a jam-packed evening of culture, conversation, and community fun, hosted by the London Irish Centre Ambassador, Angela Scanlon, and friends. So from 4 o'clock on the 17th, the Centre will stream a special virtual event to celebrate the very best of Irish culture and community in London. The event is free and will be available on the Centre's website and social media. And the theme for the event is London Le Chéile, which is the Irish for London Together, which captures the spirit of collaboration, creativity, and community shown by the Irish in London throughout the COVID challenges. In Coventry, in Coventry on the 14th of March, Coventry celebrated an event called Culture on the Move, which was organised by Coventry Irish Society, Imagineer Productions, and Media Mania. And Imagineer worked with local professional artists, schools, and community groups to explore and map how migration has had an impact on the cultural development of the city and how each generation's experience shape and evolve their cultural identity. And it was streamed on Imagineer Productions' Facebook page and Message to Margaret's Facebook page, and is available there until the 17th of March. Moving on, the Saturday, the 20th of March, is International Day of Happiness. And this was declared by the UN in 2012 as an International Day of Happiness. And this day recognises that happiness is a fundamental human goal and calls upon countries to approach public policies in ways that improve the well-being of all peoples. And by designating a special day for happiness, the UN aims to focus world attention on the idea that economic growth must be inclusive, equitable, and balanced, such that it promotes sustainable development and alleviates poverty. And additionally, the UN acknowledges that in order to attain global happiness, economic development must be accompanied by social and environmental well-being. And the initiative to declare a day of happiness came from Bhutan, which is a country where citizens are considered to be some of the happiest people in the world. The Himalayan kingdom has championed an alternative measure of national and societal prosperity called the Gross National Happiness Index, which rejects the sole use of economic and material wealth as an indicator of development and instead adopts a more holistic outlook, where spiritual well-being of citizens and communities is given as much importance as their material well-being. And the campaign for this day is coordinated by Action for Happiness, a non-profit movement of people from 160 countries, supported by a partnership of like-minded organizations. And our last celebration, which is also on Saturday, the 20th of March, is World Storytelling Day. And for a show like this, that's very key. And this is an unofficial holiday celebrating the tradition of oral storytelling and encourages participants to tell and listen to stories from different cultures and in different languages. It wasn't always celebrated globally, but the first such day was observed in Sweden in the early 1990s and was called Alla Berättares Dag, or All Narrators Day. And soon storytellers around the world picked up on the holiday, and it's now a global celebration. And each celebration since 2004 has a theme associated with it, including strong women, dreams, neighbours, water, and monsters and dragons. And people can tap into historical and cultural stories, spread them globally, or make up their own new stories. And an event that we picked up that's relevant to our listeners is on Tuesday, tomorrow, March 16th, from 3 to 5 p.m. There's a Digital Inclusion in London Network meeting, which is one of several. And Sweyn's going to bring up on screen the registration link for that. And it's organised by HERE, which is a pan-equality network of London equality and human rights, voluntary and community sector organisations, which are hosting monthly meetings of this network.
I think that's today, actually, Pauline, at 3 o'clock.
16th, I think it says.
Oh,
it says, it does say 15th, sorry, yeah. Okay, well, it's either today or tomorrow in the afternoon. Like we said, have we said previously, we're not the BBC, but members are meeting regularly, and they members told HERE that they would benefit from meeting regularly to overcome digital exclusion in London. Some meetings are also open to policymakers, public sector colleagues and funders, as well as frontline VCS, NGOs and experts by experience. But this month's meeting is only for civil society, VCS, NGOs and experts by experience, so not public sector and policymakers. And they're saying from 3 to 4, they're going to be discussing, collecting data and launching a survey on full costs and capacity to overcome digital exclusion in real life. And there's also going to be a project, part 2 of an introduction to net mapping for people working on digital inclusion, which is a project run by HERE and co-produced with Superhighways, Inclusion London, Consortium of the Refugee Council and other tech experts. So if you're interested in that, please do have a look at it and sign up. So we now get on to our special guest today, who is Dr. Ciara Allmann, who is a postdoctoral research fellow in media law and policy at the University of Oxford. And her research focuses on digital inequality and how the pervasive digitization of everyday life is leaving people behind, and what people are doing to address the digital divide at a grassroots level. Ciara is an anthropologist who uses qualitative methods, including participant observation and interviews, to understand the lived experience of digital exclusion from the ground up. Lately, Ciara's research has focused mainly on communities that have built their own locally owned and operated internet networks, known as community networks, and on the role of public internet access points like libraries, one of our favourite topics, in helping vulnerable people bridge the digital divide. And since 2018, Ciara has volunteered as a digital helper in the Oxfordshire County Library. Ciara is also the communications director at the Oxford Human Rights Hub, an organisation working to make human rights law resources freely accessible to global audiences. And she's a proud research associate of the Whose Knowledge campaign, which works to centre the knowledge of marginalised communities on the web and raise awareness of the digital exclusions that keep the majority of the world from participating fully in digital knowledge creation and curation. And just one thing more I'd like to add, which is that Ciara's DPhil dissertation focused on the urban space, social class and digital activism during and after the 2011 Egyptian revolution. So Ciara, we are absolutely delighted to have you on the show. We referred to your address to the housing conference in January. And at the time we just thought, this is great. This woman speaks our language and we would be great to have her on the show. So we're delighted to have you. You're very welcome.
Thank you so much, Sweyn and Pauline, for having me. I'm absolutely delighted to be here. And yeah, also always delighted to meet other folks who kind of get the small scale, local aspect, local angle on the digital divide, which is something that I care deeply about. And I also just want to thank you for pulling up the Oxford Human Rights Hub website and the Who's Knowledge website. Those are two great organizations that I'm very proud to be associated with. So thank you for spotlighting them.
You're very welcome. Ciara, we're always interested in how our guests got started kind of on this path to the work that they do now. So please tell us a bit about yourself and your early career.
Yeah, okay, thanks. As we were talking about before I came on the show, I'm normally in the interviewer position, so this is an unusual experience for me. That's the kind of question I would ask on a podcast or in an interview. So, okay, let's see if I can answer it for myself. Yeah, so I'll focus kind of on my research trajectory because it was a little bit circuitous. I started as a researcher, an anthropologist working on the Middle East, and in particular, I was interested in digital politics when I got started. So my master's and PhD were focused on kind of digital politics writ large in the Egyptian revolution. So I did my field work in Egypt between 2011 and 2014. And it might seem on the face of it that doesn't have a lot to do with public libraries and digital inclusion in the UK. But what happened during that time while I was working on online and offline activism in Egypt was I started to actually become more interested in the exclusions that I was seeing in terms of who was participating online and who wasn't or just couldn't participate online in the context of the aftermath of that 2011 revolution. And so a lot of people kind of were focusing at the time on political mobilization and how people mobilized and went down into the streets. And I ended up focusing more on class and socioeconomic status and how being offline or not having access to certain platforms had an impact on people's experiences of, imagination of the Egyptian revolution and their ability to participate. So in kind of a roundabout way at that point, I came out of my DPhil really interested in the digital divide as an issue, and also wanting to make sure that in my future research, I didn't treat the Middle East as a region, or Egypt, which was my area of focus, as exceptional in some way. I actually, I had this feeling, and there was certainly research out at the time that told us that the digital divide is not exclusively a problem for like the global South or for a particular region, that in fact, the digital divide exists in our own backyards. And that was something that I really wanted to explore in my ongoing research. So after I finished my PhD, I actually kind of took a little bit of a break from academia proper, partially because working in that revolutionary context was a little bit exhausting and a bit overwhelming. And I needed a bit of time to process it beyond just writing the dissertation. And so I ended up working with the Oxford Human Rights Hub extensively, and also with the Who's Knowledge campaign that you brought up before. And this gave me an insight into kind of more on the ground grassroots organizing around internet inequality issues. And it gave me kind of, I often say it gave me like a second education in digital inequality, not an academic one, a much more activist advocacy oriented one. And following that work, I got this position that I'm now in at the University of Oxford as a postdoctoral research fellow in media law and policy is like the title. And I'm able in this position to focus much more broadly on digital inclusion. And I've kind of made the focus of my research in this post looking at local grassroots responses to digital exclusion. What are people actually doing to close the digital divide on kind of the smallest scale imaginable? And what can that teach us about how we should think about and deal with the digital divide on a much broader scale? And so that's what brings me to my research now that, as you said in my introduction, is mostly focused on rural communities and also on public access points. So places like public libraries.
Wonderful, wonderful. If you don't mind indulging us a bit, you said you had a circuitous route to where you are now. What were some of the early influences in your young life? You know, how did you get onto this track?
Ooh, that's an interesting question. Yeah. Okay. So my background is, so my undergraduate work was actually in political science and linguistics. And before that, I had a lot of wide ranging interests, to be honest. I knew that I was becoming interested in politics, for instance, when I was in high school, but I come from quite an artistic family. So my parents are both trained as professional actors. And so my sister and I have one younger sister. We kind of grew up sort of both being very politically aware, but also being very interested in the arts. So we did a lot of writing, acting, music. And I think that looking back, this cultivated in me some kind of an interest in communication. So although I kind of knew that I wasn't going to become an actor, or I didn't want to kind of go into the arts proper the way that my parents had done when they were younger. I was really fascinated by human interactions. My parents used to say things like, that watching other people in public spaces or in everyday situations was a good character study. That's how they would put it, as from an acting perspective. But now in my later academic career, I look back and I think, well, that's what anthropology is actually. As an anthropologist, we also kind of look at human interactions as a place of study. And so I'm sure in some way, probably quite an obvious one now that I'm thinking about it, that childhood around my parents and that artistic community really influenced my interest in people and human interaction and communication in particular. And then when I had the opportunity to go to university, I found myself constantly drawn to questions of communication. So how were people communicating? How has language changed over time? How does language influence our expectations and our politics and our imaginations? And kind of strangely, I guess, that brought me directly to the internet. So my interest in the internet was really derived out of that. So like I said a moment ago, my undergrad degrees were in political science and linguistics, and my interest in linguistics became really focused on how is the internet changing, influencing language? How are we communicating differently? I remember writing a paper that I had a lot of fun working on that was about how I studied Arabic in undergrad, hence the Middle Eastern studies later. And I looked in this paper at how people were using Arabic online and kind of using the Roman alphabet to type in Arabic, and the kind of linguistic culture that was emerging around typing in Arabic and developing Arabic resources on the internet. And so that was kind of perfectly blending in a way my interest in politics and culture, language, and this digital platform. And lo and behold, that kind of led me down the line to working more on digital specifically. And then the Middle East came into that much more prominently. And here I am today. I feel like that was a very circuitous way of describing my circuitous path, but I guess there you go.
Yeah.
It's interesting that your interest in language has taken you through and understand how people communicate to what the digital thing is and how some people have difficulty accessing it. Yeah.
There must be a temptation, Ciara, as an academic, to just concentrate on academia, and because it's such a huge world, and when you were talking about media law, kind of I was kind of imagining that high level discussions of what's legal and so on. But of course, as John Popham, who founded this show, wrote on his home the blog on his homepage, is about how being educated about the media helps us to make better decisions because we're better informed, because we know what's true and what might not be true, and so on. So I can see a direct correlation. But the temptation to just kind of hang around with academics, that's not what you're about.
No, yeah. It's true that I have a very fraught relationship personally with academia, to be honest. I love it because it's sort of a very unusual and unique space in which I get to kind of think big thoughts a lot of the time, and that's the value. I recognize that it's a tremendous privilege to be able to have the space to think and to really interrogate kind of the realities that exist and that we live in today, and that's what I value most most about academia, and being able to debate those ideas in a community of knowledge producers. That's incredibly unique. I value it deeply, but I also feel very strongly that it's problematic to stay kind of trapped or siloed in the quote unquote ivory tower and not get out into the real world. I mean, a big reason why I love anthropology is that it gives me the opportunity to spend time with people in everyday life doing things that they would normally do. So it's very social, interpersonal, human, grounded, whereas academia can sometimes not quite be that. And so I feel like it's important, especially in the work that I do that looks at contemporary issues around digital exclusion and inclusion, to maintain a connection to the quote unquote real world. I'm not sure that dichotomy is entirely fair, but I still kind of recognize that there needs to be a bridge between academia and everyday life for people who live in a lot of different circumstances, academia and policy. And that's what I like about the role that I have now, is it's got the word policy in it. So I'm very justified in having conversations that do that bridging from academia out into the wider world. I also, just as a final note on that point, I very much feel that it's important for academics to be able to speak in different registers. And here's the communication element again. I think it's important for us to be able to translate what we do to different audiences. And that means that when I speak to academics, maybe I talk about theory and I ground my findings in a much more kind of abstract and complicated language than I might when I'm speaking to policymakers or folks building their own internet network, which is amazing. But that's important because I think as academics, as people, it's very valuable to be able to code switch like that between different communities. And it forces me to think through my ideas in a different way and try to make them clearer. So I really value that bridging process in terms of refining my thinking about a topic, because thinking about how to communicate it in different ways does that.
Excellent.
And also, it's a feature in taking broadly science. This concept of science communication has been an increasing thing over the last probably 30, 40 years. And I guess it applies to almost any discipline, academic discipline, really. The communication of it to others is more difficult for some to see the value of and to actually achieve. I suppose anthropology has got to be good at it because of the subject. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I guess sometimes we're not so good at communicating. I don't want to give the impression I'm always great at communicating. I'm definitely
no.
That's kind of part of it, is we get it wrong a lot of the time, and that's a learning experience as well. Especially in anthropology, I think it's just such a humbling experience when you're in the field and you're working with a community and you realize, oh, I'm either not really being accepted here for whatever reason, or I'm not communicating very well, and therefore there's a lot of misunderstanding and things like that. And it makes you realize, that we're all human, and that means kind of adjusting and recognizing our limitations. So yeah, absolutely. And I agree that it's important in any discipline to be able to communicate across that divide. Also, arguably, I mean, the public funds research, the taxpayer money underwrites a lot of the amazing work that's happening in the academy. And I think it's our responsibility, regardless of what we study, whether it's Shakespeare or digital inclusion in libraries, to be able to communicate back to the public what it is that we're doing with that funding and what kind of knowledge creation is happening in the academy and why it's important.
I think my experience of academia kind of started way back. My father was an academic, so I'm aware of some of the expected standards and so on in academia. And when I first started mixing with academics in Birmingham, I was surprised how few of them were on Twitter, were sharing openly what they were doing. I think it's changed now, but it's or changing anyway. But it's still not that common to find, the academics that you want to find online so easily, so that you can, have these open conversations. So it's good to know that you're not one of those, that you're bucking the trend. I was going to ask you something else. Yeah. So, oh yeah. So you're saying about some of the projects that you've visited and had exposure to. So we'd love to hear more about that, especially about Barn if you've visited them, because Chris Condor is someone we want to get on the show at some stage. John was very, very keen on Chris and all of the work that she was doing. So please tell us something about some of these projects that you know about.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I can start with Barn since you mentioned Barn, and I'm a huge fan of Barn. I have spent time with them up in rural Lancashire, and I do know Chris Condor. She's an amazing, amazing, formidable woman, and you should absolutely have her on the show. Absolutely, a great person to speak about that local grassroots activism and advocacy around digital inclusion. So actually, I'll just give you a small amount of context, then I'll talk a little bit about Barn. So my postdoc project really was meant to be focused on community networks, and I was meant to spend even more time with Barn than I have actually gotten to spend with them. And unfortunately, COVID-19 intervened, and just as I was about to plan and go out on another big round of field work and spend more time in rural Lancashire, I wasn't able to. So I am disappointed about that, but I'm very glad that I at least was able to make some initial connections and spend some initial time out there. Since then, I've continued to maintain a connection to Barn by engaging in their online groups and also participating in a number of their online meetings. So as an anthropologist, I just switched gears a little bit, and now it's kind of all remote connectivity with Barn. But I wrote a piece about Barn, which if anyone's interested in reading, is available on The Conversation, and it was republished in The Independent. And that was right at the beginning of this whole COVID-19 lockdown period. I believe it came out in July. So if you're interested in reading more about the kind of work that I started doing in Barn, that article is a great place to start. By way of a bit of an overview of Barn, Barn stands for Broadband for the Rural North, and the number 4 is in there. So it's a little confusing for people because it doesn't necessarily look like the word barn, but they say barn.
Barn.
Yeah, exactly. And it's a community network, meaning that it's community owned and operated. Oh yeah, bring it up on the screen. That's great. Oh yes, that's my article.
Yeah.
That's great. Yeah, yeah, thank you.
Google is indeed my friend. Other search engines are available.
So the title of the article is Digital DIY, the superfast internet network built by locals in the Yorkshire Dales.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like the Lancashire folks are going to be really offended by that, actually, because okay. So the opening of the article, I start with a story.
The author is never responsible for the headline.
Exactly. Yeah, this is the problem. Thank you for that. I need that defense. So the opening story in the article takes place in Clapham, which is a village that's actually kind of right on the border, but it's technically in Yorkshire. And so a lot of the reposting that occurred of this article, it was kind of like Yorkshire Network, and I was sort of like, oh no, the Lancashire folks are going to be really offended. But yeah, it kind of spans, the network actually spans across Lancashire and into Yorkshire, but it's the rural north, basically, hence the name Barn. And yeah, it's a network that was originally spearheaded by volunteers. So it started a number of years ago with Chris Condor, whom you mentioned, and a small handful of really active volunteers who were frustrated about not having good connectivity in their rural areas. And this is a serious issue in the UK. If you're talking about the digital divide, the rural-urban divide needs more attention. It's gotten a bit more in recent months due to COVID, but there are real problems in terms of speed and just access to internet in rural communities. And this rural area, so Chris Condor is from a village called Ray, which is in the rural northwest of England. And her village was just basically unconnected to the internet. And then they tried a number of different things, including building a wireless mesh network, which I can talk about more if that's of interest, but with a local university, Lancaster University, and some academics there helped kind of like design it, implement it, build it. And that helped. I think they got like a 5 megabit connection or something like that with this local mesh network, which was pinging wireless signals around the village. But if any of you have ever been to rural Lancashire, wireless isn't great solution for that area because of the fact that there are loads of trees, forests, hills, rivers, you name it.
Line of sight is a bit of a
Exactly.
theoretical concept. Yes.
Exactly. And like, so line of sight was a bit of a nightmare. And in some places you really wouldn't get a good connection. So Chris and her colleagues decided they needed something better, especially when video started coming along and YouTube was getting popular. In fact,
I've always said this. I'm going to say this now. I've always said this. When you're working out how much bandwidth you need, imagine having 3 simultaneous interactive video calls and scale for that. And it'll take you very quickly to fiber. Or something very, or the next notch down. Anything else is just
exactly.
The pandemic has proved this. You might have 2 adults in a household trying to work remotely. You might have a child or 2 also trying to do a live, and you're there immediately. Just straight. Pandemic has handed us this obvious, to me, forever obvious use case just on a plate. And anyone trying to scale for anything less than that now it's just insane.
Absolutely. No, exactly. I mean, that's almost word for word what you'll hear from the folks who live in barn land, as they kind of affectionately call it.
Well, I live in University of the Highlands and Islands land, and we've learned through another strand of academia, really, that A, it can be done if you put some resources into it, and B, it's fabulously beneficial to everyone, not just as you say, not just the academy. Sorry, you set me off.
No, I'm actually delighted you jumped in, so I didn't have to say all that stuff, give you a break from talking for a minute. That's great. 100%, totally agree. That was kind of the logic behind Barn, the group of volunteers that kind of identified themselves as Barn, switching to their focus to fiber. So that was exactly the next step in the story. So they decided they needed a fully fiber optic network that was fiber to the home in order to provide that high speed connection. It was really going to be the only sort of future-proof solution for that area. And then remarkably, so they teamed up again with a university professor who had experience of network design and network building, and they built this network really, really on the cheap by network standards, by fundraising within the community. And
it was kind of a Scandinavian model almost. There were a number of projects in municipalities in particularly Sweden and Finland that go back into the 20 noughts that have taken the same kind of communitarian type approach, and that's what's been so fascinating and interesting about Barn, as they've overcome the regulatory and market barriers which are there almost by design in the UK to try and get there to where they've got to. It's great.
No, it's brilliant. And so the network today is still community owned. It's now, there's a company, well, it's a community benefit society. So it's a bit like in the US, we'd probably just call it a co-op. But it's community owned and run, and they have employees that actually maintain the network now, but that wasn't the case in the beginning. In the early days, it really was just volunteers building it. They got their diggers out, they dug the trenches, they learned how to lay the fiber. They learned from other networks like the ones you just mentioned, Sweyn, in Scandinavia and elsewhere. They did a lot of information gathering and a lot of kind of workshops with other people who had tried to do the same thing, and then they brought it back to Lancashire and did it there. And now they've connected. I mean, the number is growing constantly. So I think when I wrote the article, it was like 8,000 homes or something like that. I'm sure it's even more than that now, because they've just continued pushing to get more people on. And the remarkable outcome really is 2 things at least. One is the extremely affordable cost of this fully fiber connection that folks in that area have. It's a flat £30 a month for a full gigabit symmetrical up and down connection, which is really remarkable in the UK if you compare it to other costs. And schools and churches get the connection for free, and that's amazing. Libraries as well, and so that's really great. And then the other thing is they've really coupled it with community interventions for people who are kind of new to the internet, don't know how to use that gigabit connection they have. I mean, most people don't use the full gigabit capability anyway, but some people, I mean, rural communities in the UK tend to be a bit older on average than urban communities. And so a lot of folks don't have high digital literacy. And so Barn runs a computer club that's volunteer run and organized to help those people who are a little bit unsure about how to use that connection, get online and use it. And so it's really that coupling of the personal digital skills and literacy support network alongside the fancy high-speed fiber connection. And it's really having both of those things working together that makes it such a success story, I think.
Excellent. So how much bigger is it now than when you first started knowing about it?
Okay, so to be honest, I first started stalking Barn when I was finishing. That's true. That's true. When I was finishing my DPhil. So I think I first heard about them maybe in 2014 or so. And so it's been a long time that I've had my eye on Barn and sort of had in the back of my mind that I wanted to do something on community networks in my research work. And then I got in touch with them properly in 2018. And thankfully, it was Chris, I believe, actually, who was the person who responded to me first and said, yeah, come up here and see what we're doing. So, and my interest was really because during, again, it kind of links oddly to the Egyptian Revolution, but during the Egyptian Revolution, there were a number of internet shutdowns. And during those periods of shutdowns, activists were coming up with kind of creative solutions to connecting to the internet and bypassing the shutdowns. And I had this interest in kind of learning more about that. So I just sort of like alongside my DPhil research was asking a lot about how are you doing this, blah, blah, blah. And through that, I learned about community networks that were built and owned by communities as an alternative to either state-owned infrastructure or commercially owned infrastructure. And in kind of doing some searching around that, I came across Barn and I thought, wow, this is an amazing project. I really would like to learn more about it.
Mm.
Yeah, and it has grown tremendously. So yeah, to directly answer your question, since 2014, I mean, it's grown just hugely from like a couple of villages that had it in the early days. I think between 2012 and 2014, it was its initial kind of growth phase. Now though, so when I started doing my research, I think there were 6,000 homes connected was the information they had on the website. And I remember thinking, wow, that's really impressive. And now it's at least 8,000. I would bet that my statistics are outdated actually, because that was the number from last July. Mm-hmm. So and they've continued pushing forward. And in that article, I write specifically about how they've continued trying to connect people during lockdown and tried to overcome some of the restrictions of COVID, which is another thing that community groups are capable of doing in a really spectacular way, in a way that companies and governments sometimes just can't because they don't have the flexibility. And they've stayed COVID compliant, but they've managed to get more and more people online at a time when they desperately need to be online. So I think it's a great story.
Mm.
How have they, do you think, got over the problem that some other projects at a community level have been, that they've been other projects have been kind of outflanked by the rollout of BT broadband? Is that down to them focusing specifically on fiber and therefore sort of getting ahead of the technological curve, or is there something else going on there?
Yeah, I mean, it depends, I think, a lot on where people live, how competitive BT is as an alternative, or any other company for that matter, BT being kind of the most recognizable and extensive network probably. But so I think there are kind of a couple of factors. One is the service that people get from Barn and the cost. You get the full gigabit connection for the flat £30 a month, which you can't get on BT. And so a lot of people feel like, you know, they'd prefer to have that quality of connection. Plus the customer service is a lot more personalized. It's extremely local. The Barn employees and volunteers work tirelessly over weekends, evenings, you name it. Someone will come and help and fix your connection, which is something you just don't get from any commercial provider, really, that kind of service. So people really value that. And then in some areas, even when this is a common complaint, even when a company like BT claims to have connected the area, the connection to sort of more far-flung farms, for instance, and houses that are a bit further away from the center of a town or village will not have an actual internet connection that is usable. And so that makes Barn a really good, viable alternative because BT has connected the
quite a few examples in Scotland over the years of attempting to do something similar. But it's always seemed to be the case that the costs have run away with the project, possibly because of the ultra remote nature of locations of some of them. Thinking about the the project that was in the Western Isles about 12 years ago, which was based on wireless, and suddenly found they had to build lots of masts, which they hadn't bargained for, and all that sort of stuff. So it just seems to be that Barn has somehow, and I think actually you've put your finger on it. They've kind of started really small and been absolutely unwilling to compromise as far as the fiberness of the connections are concerned, and they've treated everybody in their community the same. I guess that's just how it works, just how success works.
Yeah, I mean, I think the costs also tremendously go up when you start hiring contractors or trying to outsource the work. Like a big thing for Barn that I can't emphasize enough is volunteers still do a huge amount of the labor. And if you're a village that wants to get on Barn, they will not come to you. I mean, it seems like quite a harsh policy in a way, but they will not come to you if there isn't enough interest. So people don't express enough interest within the village to make it viable. So you have to get your neighbors and community on board, which is a social problem. It's not a technological problem. And then additionally, you have to be committed to doing some of the labor yourself. You have to agree to be doing some of the digging. I mean, now they actually do a sizable amount of the digging as an organization because they have the human infrastructure to do that. But they'll say, you're going to have to get your spade out is sort of what they'll say. And if you don't want to do that, this isn't the network for you. And that keeps the costs down.
I remember hearing about a story of, I met the mayor of a Swedish municipality. I can't remember what it was called. I want to say Tromsø or something like that, who was giving a talk in the Orkney Science Festival about how they were doing a community fibre project. And basically the model there was, you dig the trench to the main road and we'll connect you from there. And if you don't want it, don't dig your trench. And it just seems to me that, and also kind of the other end of the spectrum for Scandinavian models is there's the region of Kaustinen in Finland, which used 1995 accession money, Finnish accession money from the EU to connect every single public sector site that they had using their own fibre to kind of proper ATM standards. And then they suddenly had a fabulous network, which was all run by 2 technicians in their smallest village. That was a design feature to try and get buy-in from all the other political entities around. 7 municipalities working together. Put your headquarters in the smallest one, and you'll get them to buy. No, nobody can say that the big town is taking it all over. And they gradually then backwards designed a plan to start connecting their citizens. And the reasons they wanted to do that were for medical and social services and education reasons. Their argument was that if they knew that all their citizens were connected, then when their people turned up, they would be able to connect and do much more for the people, their clients, effectively, their service users. So yeah, I mean, what astonishes me is that there are so few successful projects like this in the UK, and I don't know why you think that might be.
Well, I think probably a common response you'd hear from folks that have attempted it, and also folks that have been successful, is that it just requires a huge amount of personal investment of time and energy. You really need digital champions, and I'm not just talking about folks like Chris Conder here, who's really was the initial powerhouse behind Barn, but actually local village champions who are as committed as Chris is in their local community to get this to get Barn rolled out, and they do, as I said, they will come out evenings, weekends, help you fix your connection, and these are local people who live down the street from you. You need those passionate individuals, and even kind of nutty individuals, people often say, that are like that committed, that really want to get the connection. Without that local buy-in and local support on a personal level, it's very difficult to get a project like this off the ground, because it does require a lot of time and effort and labor. But there are knock-on benefits to that. A lot of communities have kind of rediscovered a sense of cohesion out of building networks like this. And that to me is kind of the beautiful human story of this kind of digital networking. I mean, I think the technology is great, and I'm very impressed by the way they've built it. But for me, what's interesting is the kind of new communal life that villages that are on these kinds of community run networks have achieved as a result of the process of building it. And so that has less to do with with the digital connectivity than it does with the human connectivity that kind of underpins the success of these projects. So I would say that's probably the main reason. It's a big reason why these projects can't be easily run centrally by a municipality or something like that, because it decontextualizes the project from the people who are actually going to use it.
Yeah, there's a great report that we've referred to previously on the show about the value of small and the value of small in the crisis, which Lloyds Bank Foundation produced recently. And yeah, the value of small organizations just being able to just get on and do it, and you know, individuals and so on, it can't be understated, and has really come to the fore in the last 12 months, certainly, if not more. So one of the other things that we really liked about you and your work, Kira, was your hands-on getting involved to helping people as a digital helper. So please, can you tell us more about that? How you got started, and why someone in your kind of might be considered a lofty with experience would want to, you know, help people on a one-to-one basis?
Sure. Yeah. So I started as a digital helper, volunteering as a digital helper in the Oxfordshire County Library, which is in the Oxford City Centre, in 2018, around the time when I started this new postdoctoral position. And I actually volunteered not with any interest in doing research in the library or using it as a research site. I genuinely just volunteered to volunteer. And the reason, my logic was that I knew I was going to be working on digital inclusion in my day job as an academic. And yeah, as you say, rightly, a kind of lofty position in the academy. And as you know, it's very important to me to stay grounded, as I mentioned earlier in the conversation, in the lived reality of people who experience digital exclusion. Otherwise, why am I studying it? And so I wanted to do something hands-on, kind of in my free time, I guess, that allowed me to stay connected and see this reality for myself. And this opportunity presented itself to be a volunteer in the library, helping people with digital needs and skills. And I thought, oh, well, that's a great way to kind of put the work I'm doing in the academy to work for people for real on the front lines. So that's how I started. But then, as often happens with these things, I can't turn the research part of me off completely. And I started volunteering. I saw what was happening in these libraries, and I kind of thought, okay, I haven't heard a lot about this before in the academy or elsewhere in policy circles. And it was remarkable, the range of needs people were bringing into the library. This really struck me. And then the librarians doing so much, just going over and above the call of duty, so to speak, in order to help people access things that they needed desperately online, from printing pay slips to accessing health documents, to booking GP appointments, to things you'd expect, like logging into universal credit. And I asked the librarians who I was working with, because I was there volunteering, you know, do you have any record? Do you know what people are coming in here asking about? Do you keep a record of that? Or do you? And they're like, we do not have the capacity to do that, which is understandable because they're already spread very thin. And I said, would it be helpful if the university, through me, were able to document this and actually get some data about what is the library doing? Who are they helping? What are the questions people are bringing into libraries? And when they said yes, the Oxfordshire Digital Inclusion Project, which I lead now with Dr. Grant Blank from the Oxford Internet Institute, that's how it was born, was out of that sort of conversation. So I didn't go into with the idea of running this research project, but I came out of it just feeling like this was a site of digital inclusion action that needed to be spotlighted.
Brilliant. And you've written in the blog post that we referred to earlier, the one in your address to the housing conference, about helping a particular individual. I think you've probably you're not picking out a particular individual, maybe a conglomeration or elements from various people. Can you tell us that story, please?
Yeah. So the story is of Margaret, which is not the real name of this individual. It was somebody whom I had helped as a digital helper during one of my normal volunteering sessions. And I started from the very beginning kind of keeping field notes, which is what we do in anthropology when we're doing participant observation. And I had done this anyway. I was doing this anyway when I was volunteering, because I kind of, like I said, I can't turn the research side of me off. And I just thought, okay, I need to take this down. But since then, I've used Margaret as a good entry point, her story as a good entry point for talking about the complexities of the needs that people bring into a public library. And so she appears in the post that you mentioned. She appeared in the opening remarks that you heard at that conference. And she also appears in a new academic article that just came out, and it's open access, so it's free to view, which was also very important to us in Information, Communication, and Society. And that just came out this past month. So Margaret was a woman who came in. She had a letter from the council telling her that in order to search for council housing online, she's a council housing resident, she was going to need to set up an online account for the first time. Normally, she had done this in an analog way, but she had this letter saying from now on, you can only do this digitally. And she had never really used the internet, and she didn't have internet at home. And so she came in saying, I need to set up an account and I need to be able to search the housing list. Can we do this? Now, a typical digital helping session at the library that I was volunteering at was 30 minutes, a 30-minute slot. I believe she had booked 2 back to back. So we actually had an hour, but we're talking about somebody who didn't even have an email address when she arrived. So what we did was we sat down. She was very enthusiastic to get online, but just had never done it before, which is a very common thing in the libraries. And so we sat down. She said, I think I probably need an email address in order to do this. I said, you're right, you do need an email address. And so I asked her what kind of email she wanted. She wanted to use Gmail, which is very common. That's the one people have heard of. And so we sat down at the computer to log in. And from that very moment, it was obvious we had a lot more issues to contend with, because she had a library card. She knew she needed to type in the number to the login window on the library computer terminal. And she really could not type. And she struggled to press kind of each of the keys. She'd often press a key too long, so you'd get kind of double letters or double numbers. And she also really couldn't control the mouse. The mouse was just going all over the screen. So she asked me as the digital helper to help her type it in. Now, as a digital helper, I tend to try to get people to do as much of it for themselves as they can, because it's, that physical memory is very useful for when you're going back to log in. But I did help her log in to the library computer. So once we were in, I was thinking, okay, now we've got a few challenges ahead of us. So we open up Gmail. And to set up a new account, you need to type in a username, as everybody kind of knows, probably watching the show. And her name was already taken, which confused her. Why couldn't she use her name as her email account? So I had to explain that. And then we had to create a password that she would remember. And she didn't know how to capitalize letters on the keys, on the keyboard. When I talk about this story, the reason I use it is because I've already been talking now for probably a couple of minutes about Margaret from the beginning to this point, and we haven't even set up the email account yet in this story. And the point of telling the story is that, is this tedious? Yes, it's very tedious. Is it like almost unnecessarily complicated? Yes. And that's the reason why whenever I write about this example, I'm using it to kind of force the reader, who's probably a digital native or is digitally fluent, to think about the world through Margaret's eyes. Mm-hmm. And how complicated just this simple task might be. And I'll just give one additional example from her experience, because otherwise we'll be here all day getting Margaret on the housing list, because it took much longer than that hour. But one thing that, for instance, comes out from actually observing somebody in that situation is, for instance, the challenge of 2-factor authentication. So finally, when Margaret got her password typed in, something she could remember, and I taught her how to capitalize letters, and she was very excited about that. It then prompted us to enter a code that she received on a mobile phone. Well, Margaret, like many people who are digitally excluded, didn't own a mobile phone or didn't have one with her. And she certainly didn't have a smartphone. And so she said, oh, well, I don't have a phone. What can we do? So we actually had to go back to square one at that point, because Gmail, there's no workaround with Gmail now if you don't have a phone. So in fact, I had to think about, okay, what other email service provider could we set her up with where she won't be prompted for a login? Now, really the point at the end of this story is, if you're the council and you're thinking about how to set up your websites to help people search for council housing, and you know that statistically the people who are in council housing are likely to be more digitally excluded on average than people in the general British population, you need to think very carefully about the third-party providers that you're requiring people to use in order to just access your site. You're a government site, and so therefore you're essential. But just by requiring somebody to have a separate email account that they manage and monitor and know how to use, you're sending Margaret into kind of the commercial sphere and complicating the tasks she needs to complete tremendously. And that's why I think it's such a useful story to kind of open a conversation about digital inclusion in this digital by default age.
And it's great, that story, because it shows how detailed the steps are, how many steps there are for each individual transaction for people who are starting from scratch. And it should point out the sheer scale of requirement as well, because it's quite easy to multiply the number of people who don't have an email account by the number of people who might need to be on a housing list, and so on and so on. And you'll quit if it's going to take you an hour or 2 hours per transaction like that. Then that's a fabulous cost, for a fabulous amount of time required from somewhere, and there just seems to have been no acknowledgement of this at all. Other than a bit of token funding for big projects that come and go across the nation, the 4 nations. And yet there's this resource sitting here, not looking for things to do, but perfectly capable of doing it with just a library network. It seems to me astonishing that there isn't a bit more sort of connected thinking about all that stuff.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, and libraries across the country are doing this work broadly, thanklessly, and without recognition, because libraries are the natural place people go. And,
well, there was a big, about 15 years ago, maybe longer, there was the big People's Library.
Exactly.
People's Network,
connect all the libraries to the internet to do this kind of work. Now, in those days, the amount of online services was probably very low, but it just seems so obvious that you build on that foundation to create the human resources available to help people. But no, apparently not.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, the library, the digital volunteer program at the Oxfordshire Libraries is impressive. I think before the COVID lockdown, they had about 80 digital volunteers across the 44 libraries of the network. But they needed probably about 3 times as many digital helpers. And so, recruitment, funding, supports is really desperately needed. And I think there's also a question, depends, people had different opinions on this, about whether that service should actually be a paid staff role as opposed to a volunteer role. There are benefits to bringing volunteers in, I think, and so it's probably, the answer is it should be a mixed provision. But yeah, libraries serve this role because people naturally go there. They feel safe there, and things are free, and they get referred to libraries by other places like job centers. And
yeah, there's a myth that the libraries are all keyed up and stocked up to do this, but it's not quite the case. There needs to be the investment. Even if you are using volunteers, there's a cost to recruiting and maintaining and supporting them, as you say.
Exactly.
Definitely. Yeah. I mean, I know the various library authorities have, there's been a number of campaigns about this, and I myself spoke to Nick Poole, who's the CEO of CILIP, the Chartered Institute of Libraries and Information Professionals, about it in detail a few years ago, but even more recently on Twitter and stuff, he's talking about it, and the money that would be needed to make public libraries kind of functional, more functional. I mean, there's a Public Libraries and Museums Act 1964 that still says public authorities have to provide a public library service. It's how they interpret that.
There is the equivalent in Scotland, and I think in Northern Ireland as well. There's equivalent legislation.
Yeah. So it's what should be provided, and often isn't, and well, sometimes isn't, and libraries and library staff, to my knowledge, go above and beyond, much like teachers, in providing services for people they know won't get them anywhere else. And the more of that we can do, the better. Ciara, we're coming towards the end of the show, and we'd love to talk to you for a lot longer. And I hope that we can have you on again, and that people will follow up on the show. I've asked people on YouTube if they have any questions for you. We've had nothing so far, but there may be follow-ups. If people want to contact you directly, I know you're online. What's the best way to contact you?
So probably the two best ways would be via Twitter. I'm at Ciara Allmann, just my name on Twitter. And you can also reach me at my email address, which is easily findable on the Oxford University website, which you pulled up, Sweyn, at the beginning. So feel free to send me an email there as well. That's
great. Thank you very much. I just wanted to refer to one of the stories as we finish, Sweyn, if you don't mind, because it's the last one, which is about the Web Foundation. We're celebrating the foundation of the web, which was 32 years ago in this month. And they point out that to build a better world from the COVID crisis, we need a global push to connect the world's young people. And they're saying a third of young people have no internet access at all, and many more lack the data, devices, and reliable connection they need to make the most of the web. In fact, only the top third of under 25s have a home internet connection, according to UNICEF, leaving 2.2 billion young people without the stable access they need to learn online, which has helped so many others continue their education during the pandemic. And when young people do get online, Tim Berners-Lee wrote this article. When young people do get online, he says too often they're confronted with abuse, misinformation, and other dangerous content, which threatens their participation and can force them from platforms altogether. And this is especially true for those disproportionately targeted on the basis of their race, religion, sexuality, abilities, and gender. And obviously the consequences of this exclusion affects everyone. How many brilliant young minds fall on the wrong side of the digital divide, and how many voices of would-be leaders are being silenced by a toxic internet. So every young person who can't connect...
Mute inglorious Tim Berners-Lee.
You say again?
Some mute inglorious Tim Berners-Lee, as you might say.
Yeah. So he goes on to say, every young person who can't connect represents a lost opportunity for new ideas and innovations that could serve humanity. And he refers to a plethora of young people in the article, including a woman I know quite well, Hira Hussain. And he's saying, imagine how Hira and other people could tackle critical challenges if they could access a safe and empowering web. So that's echoing our brief as well here, and we hope that we can change that in the years to come. So thanks again, Ciara, for being with us today. Thanks, Sweyn, and we hope that you all have a great week. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much.